Welcome back to The Source. It's Labor Day, a day that I like to say, are you working hard or hardly working? Which is an appropriate question to ask with regards to the state of unions in this country. And joining me now from our Ottawa bureau is a guy who always works hard, is John Robson, the Sun News Network exclusive commentator. John, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
You know, unions, when I think about unions, I think of things brought in during the Industrial Revolution to protect coal workers from working 18 hours a day, to bring in basic safety standards, maybe to stop 8-year-olds from working in factories. I think the idea of unions today, as they're commonly known, that is, you know, people who work for the government in an office, I think it would make people giggle 150 years ago. What, you work in an office for the government 32 hours a week and you're in a union? I mean, is there anything in common between the public sector unions that dominate the union workforce today and the real protect the workers unions of 200 years ago?
Well, no, there is nothing, including, no offense, but those unions you're talking about don't exist. Unions were brought in once there was a sympathetic public and a sympathetic legislature, long after those protective laws were passed. You know, major unionization in the United States didn't come until the 1930s because unions were pretty clearly conspiracies and restraint of trade, and you had to get pretty nimble on your feet to find some way that you could legalize them and give them this special privilege to hold employers and customers to ransom. And no matter how hard you tried, in the private sector, this just killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. I mean, in Canada today, 71% of the public sector thereabouts is unionized, about 17% of the private sector. Those are 2007 numbers. In the private sector, it just doesn't work, but in the government sector, you can't take your business somewhere else, so no matter what negative effect they have on productivity, you could still use them to extract resources from the customer, known as the taxpayer.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. I mean, if you have too successful a union in a private sector company, like you say, you kill the goose that lays the golden egg, but in the government, they can always just raise taxes or run another deficit. So you really, it's just extracting a layer of wealth. Economists would use the phrase rent seeking. Now, John, I've got some survey numbers out there taken by Nanos Research in honor of Labor Day. Let's look at some of these results and you tell me if there's anything interesting in this first chart shows Canadians' views on unions. Do they think unions are very positive or very negative? The first one is job security for employees. 46% say very positive, 34% say somewhat positive. Obviously, it's true. And in my mind, that's half the problem, is you can't get rid of the bad apples. What do you think?
Well, I think that this is the best news for union supporters, is that high opinion. Of course, in the government, there's pretty much job security anyway. And in the private sector, in the short run, it may work, but in the long run, it makes the whole business uncompetitive, as people realize. And there's no job security working for a firm that failed.
You know, it drives me crazy, this job security based on you've been there a long time, they can't get rid of you. I remember in my province of Alberta, decades ago, there was a public school teacher named Jim Keegstra who taught crazy conspiracy theories about Jews. But the Alberta Teachers Association, the labor union that backs teachers, went to his aid because they wanted to stop the precedent that you could fire someone for being incompetent or even kooky. The teachers union backed up that convicted racist because they didn't want to end that precedent of protect everyone, including the bad apples. Isn't that really what unionization is about in the 21st century?
Well, certainly union activists seem to be able to develop a bad attitude that makes them oblivious to how the public will see them. I mean, unions could be a bit obstinate about defending people whose performance was not up to standard without having to back cases like that. But you know, the other thing, I mean, I've worked in the private sector. I've worked in a number of different companies. And tell you what, companies that make their employees miserable lose talent. You know, the protection that you need is you find a company that understands you're doing a good job for them and they will look out for you. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't have bad luck in the workforce, but you can find another job. This whole idea that a job is a kind of a property right, and you get the job and you just get to keep it no matter what. I don't even know why you'd want it, but that's a fantasy rule. In the real world, companies need employees that perform, and no amount of jumping up and down and yelling and according special legal rights can change that.
Let's go to the next slide, and I think it's slightly less striking. Let's call it up here. If you were given the choice in your current job or your formerly unionized job, would you want to be unionized, not unionized, or don't know? And 57% would say they would rather be not unionized. 37% would say they would want to be unionized. I'm surprised that only 37% wouldn't want to be unionized. I mean, as we've been just talking about, I mean, it's really a job for life. But I guess 57% of people want the freedom of working, you know, as sort of participants. I mean, I think of a place like WestJet where the workers are shareholders and there's sort of an esprit de corps. I guess, thank God, still a majority of Canadians like the idea of having a friendly relationship at work rather than an adversarial one.
I think they do, and I think probably there's a wider awareness than union activists would like to think about, that unions in Canada use coerced dues for non-collective bargaining purposes. I think people don't like unions partly because, and I'm in this category that shows up on the next slide, I was once in a union, but I was never asked if I wanted to join. When I tried to find out what union I was in, I was initially misinformed. I had no say in the running of that union. I didn't agree with its stand on pay and conditions. I certainly didn't agree with its political stance. Canadians know that unions are a way of making them look more left-wing than they are with money they didn't choose to give. And that obviously rubs people the wrong way, even if they might want to join a union that was more like a union's meant to be.
Yeah. Let's look at one more slide here. This is from the NANO survey. If we can see that on the screen now. There we go.
Here we go.
Union status. In your current job, are you unionized? Not unionized, but have been in the past. Not unionized and never have been. So I think this goes to what we were saying, is that about 32% of people say they are unionized. 17% used to be. Do you know how this compares to the United States? It's a lot higher. I don't know the exact number down there, but it's got to be, you know, this has got to be at least double the American figure.
I think it is. My impression is that the American figure for the private sector is under 10% versus the 17 or so here, and their government figure is considerably higher, but their government sector is smaller. It's interesting, yeah, 32% of Canadians are unionized, 37% want to be. I wonder how much overlap there is between those two groups, because, you know, it might be people who aren't in a union think it would help solve some of their problems, and people who are in a union think, let me out of here. But yeah, I'm in that anomalous category of people who were in a union, aren't now, never wanted to be, and I'm glad I'm not.
You know, I remember when I worked as a dishwasher, this was years ago, in a hospital in Calgary, and it was my first day at lunch, and I didn't know anyone else other than the person who hired me, so I went and sat next to her at lunch, and I was scolded by the other staff saying, we don't eat with them, we don't sit with them, we don't talk with them. There was this war between the workers and the manager. Look, it was the only person I knew. She was the person who hired me. I was a lowly dishwasher, and I got a harsh lesson right then and there about us versus them. I mean, there are some extremely radical unions in this country, but you're right, most of them are government-oriented. I remember the postal worker, their motto was, not a minute on the day, not a penny underpaid, which is they were so, I mean, they talked about the boss. The postal workers' constitution of their union is still actually uses the phrase the boss and fighting the boss. It's Marxist language, and I think you're right, John. The only way it continues to exist is because, unlike private companies that the unions have killed, like the automakers, they just cannot kill the government because it keeps sapping more money from taxpayers. Last question, John. Is there any way we can break the cycle of monopoly unions riveting onto a monopoly government, riveting onto us, so we're subsidizing these government unions through our taxes? Can we break that so that the public sector unionization rate can go down like it is in the private sector?
Well, in principle, yeah, we could just change the law, but how do we get there? You said they can't kill the government. They can. It's just slower. And these interesting statistics are the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and the percentage of government workers who have a defined benefit pension plan versus the percent in the private sector. And at some point, I think people are going to say, hey, I work hard for a living. I don't just sit in an office circulating memos. Why am I getting less money and less security than some guy in government? And that's going to be the trigger. You belong to a dishwashers union. Maybe there's some sympathy. I belong to a professors union. What kind of exploited proletariat were we? That's ridiculous, a professors union.
Professors of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but, well, I don't know what you have to lose.
Grading responsibilities. I hated grading. I was
It's tough.
toiling.
It's tough being a professor. John Robson, we're out of time. Thanks for joining us today on this Labor Day from Ottawa. Cheers. Hey,